Well, we're learning Tzurba, which is a wonderful collection of makoros on halacha, developing the halacha till practical halacha. And we're on page 189 in this essay about Tevilas Keilim. And we were talking about what materials the utensils are made of that require tefillah. We spoke about all sorts of metals, and that's explicit in the Torah. And the DeRabanan added glass. And we explained why. That was a whole discussion why. Now on page 189, he discusses the case of clay eitz and clay avonin. And we had a discussion last week about earthenware. And earthenware does not require tefillah. Now, what about other Keilim besides clay's chuchas? Are there other materials that would require tevilah? So we know we have metals, and then we have glass. And then he has something called clay etzem. And clay etzem are made of like the bones of animals, or perhaps even the bones of fish. So he says, Yesh Lodun, this is in number 25, the Kleis Chukas Gzeres Chachamim. Ulai lo gazru rak al Kleis Chukas v'al shar Keilim. He says the following: maybe you'll find other kinds of materials that make up utensils, but even if they have the same similar kind of propensities as Kleis Chukas, but nevertheless they're abominated gzera, and they required tevilah on clay's chuchas. If you can find something that's not made of glass, and it has some very distinct characteristics that are similar to clay's chuchas, they would not require tevilah. And that is the opinion of the Melamed Lahoil Rab David Tzvi Hoffman, who was Hungarian by birth, but then he settled in Germany, and he ran a great seminar for Rabbanan. But the Minchas Yitzchak has a different opinion, and he says that any substance that's similar to Kleis Chuchas should require tevilah. And Kleis Chuchas is not the exact definition of the Gzeres Chachamim, but Chuchas was only quoted as an example of a category of Keilim that have the similar characteristics that Kleis Chuchas have. And that's called Efshal Latichon, which, if you remember, we said that if it, let's say, cracks or so, you can put it into the furnace and recreate the Kli. So this is Rabbi Yitzchak Weiss. You may know that he was the head of the Beis Din in England, and then he eventually came to Eretz. He became the head of the Vadats of the Eidei Chareidis in Eretz Yisrael. And now he wants to discuss plastic. And he says the following. As far as being tovel plastic, I asked one of the scientific experts, and he says that plastic is made of either wood or it's made of some sort of a fatty substance, which is found in the ground. He calls it chelev or frumim. And he says the following: most plastic Keilim cannot be restructured. You can't put them into a furnace, it'll just disintegrate. However, he says that there's a very hard plastic. And it's so hard, this plastic, that the experts, the scientists say you can actually reform it if it cracks by putting it in a furnace. And the Minchas Yitzchak says, in this case, I'm going to encourage you to be tovel them. even though I'm going to tell you not to make a bracha, because it's not crystal clear that the Xera of Kli Zchuchas could apply beyond that to plastics. But nevertheless, even if the Chacham didn't make an explicit Xera, what they meant was the category of Zchuchas. What's the category abstract of Zchuchas? When it's a very hard substance. However, Rav Avad Yosef says we don't need Tevila on plastic, and we're not going to make any distinctions. You want to be machmir and take plastic to be toivel, okay, you get my blessing, but it's not a requirement. Now, the premise here in the poskim, and we'll see it again in Rav Avad Yosef's writings, is that whenever there's a suffix, you should bring it for tefillah and be tovel without a bracha. So as far as the bracha is concerned, suffix bracha salaka, we have to omit the bracha. But the fact that we're encouraging them to be tovel them, it depends. He says, if there's a real suffix, then you should be machmir. But if there's no suffix, you just want to be machmir. He says, although one could argue that in such a case, don't take upon yourself chumras that are not justified within the law, but no, he says, Habol achmer al atzmon, latvil below bracha, tavol bracha. So, one of the issues lurking in the background here is, will he perhaps make a bracha, and that might be a bracha she'ena tzricha. But we're not going to worry about it. We can just tell him, do what you have to do. Take it if you want to be machmir in toivel, but leave out the bracha. And we're going to assume that he's reliable enough to leave out the bracha. And now we're going to look at the Ramah in number 28, if you have that in your pages. And he says the following, Dafka ikar akli hu shel mateches. What happens if you have a kli that's made of two different materials? And he says the following. If, let's say, the ikar kli is made of wood, and there's a little bit of barzel, of iron that is attached to the wood, but it's the minority, it's not the majority. The ikar of the kli is the eitz, the wooden part. Then he says it depends. Can you use the kli? Is it functional even without the metal? If the metal makes it functional, like let's say, for example, you had a handle made of wood, but the spoon itself is made of metal. So obviously in that case you need tefillah, because the ikar of the kli is the mateches. But you could have a case where the ikar kli is a kli eitz, and therefore it doesn't have to require tefillah. And there's only ma'at barzel kavua bo. So what is going to determine whether or not there's a chi of tefillah? It depends if it's not functional without the metal part. If the metal part actually clinches the kli and makes it functional, then it needs tefillah. But if you can use the kli without the metal, then it doesn't need tefillah. Now we talk about a hybrid kli that's made of two different materials, one of which would generate tefillah, the other not. So it depends which is the ikar kli. And he gives an example here of a thermos. The inside part of the thermos is made of glass. The outside of the thermos is made of metal. But what they do is there's plastic inside the thermos. so that the ikar of the kli is barzel, but the point in which the food gets contact with this kli is not made of barzel. So he says, ain't tzarch tvila. If the barzel that is added to the kli is only to embellish the kli, but it functionally, the kli is fine without the extra metal, then it doesn't require tefillah. Okay. Now, what happens if the kli definitely needs tefillah, but I don't remember whether or not it was tovel? So once again, we're going to have to be machmir and require tefillah, but we have to leave out the brach. If, on the other hand, there's a sfek sveika, a double suffix, like, for example, you don't know if the kli was produced in Eretz Yisrael or in Chutz La'aretz, and number two, you don't know if it was ever tovel, so l'chara we should apply here the principle of sfek sveika l'kula. And he paskins here on page 191 that you can apply the principle of sfek sveika l'kula to exempt yourself from tevilah.
Sorry, why is it a sfek sveika, this situation?
Number one, he doesn't know where it was manufactured.
Oh,
and
okay.
number two, even if it was manufactured in Chutz La'aretz, it could be maybe his son or somebody else in the family actually took it to the mikveh and was tovel it. He doesn't know. See, what I find strange here is that if you don't know if the kli was tovel, then you should be assuming that it was not tovel. Why? Because it has a cheskas chiyuv. I don't know if you've been learning the Daf Yomi lately. A lot of what we're learning in Daf Yomi is about a chazaka. You know, you have a status quo and you continue. So the status quo of this kli is that it was never tovel. You want to tell me it was tovel, you should know that. But I think what he has in mind, again, I may be reading too much into it, is that most people who are observant Jews and they fulfill their obligations, they will be tovel like Keilim. So now it occurs to him, he doesn't know if he was tovel or not. So even though the Chazaka says that he wasn't tovel it, but since most people, as soon as they get hold of a kli and it needs tefillah, they don't procrastinate.
So again, that the idea that it doesn't need tefillah is only, you would say, would only be in Eretz Yisrael, because if there's more of a chance that somebody who made it was could have been Jewish. You would not have that same raya in Chutz La'aretz.
Well, let's say, yeah, I guess you'd have to talk about a case where you have a kli in Chutz La'aretz, you're not sure if it was manufactured in Israel or it was manufactured locally.
Right.
Now, there's another issue here called Dover Sheyesh Lo Matirin. And I don't want to get into it now because it's a very, very profound sugya. But let's say, for example, you have Keilim that got mixed up. And amongst them, you know that there are Keilim that need tefillah. So you might say, well, it's batal barov. Most of the Keilim were already tovel. But we have a principle called davar sheish lo matir, which means if you have a way of removing the iser, so then don't rely on rov to assume that there's no iser, but just implement the matir. And in this case, the matir is tefillah b'mikvah. Now, what I heard from my Rebbe way back when is that a davar sheish lo matirin has to be a chefza di surah, and it needs a matir. I'm not sure if that should apply in the case of Tevilas Keilim. The kli is not a chefza di surah. The Torah commands you with a mitzvah aseh, kuvaseh, to be tovel the kli. But there's no inherent iser begufo shel kli. Okay, so now that we finished discussing what metals or glass that the kli was manufactured from, now we get to what I consider the kishkis, the most important part of Tevilas Keilim, and that is to categorize Keilim. We have something called klei seuda, which are Keilim that are used in the context of a meal, of a festive meal, let's say. And again, they were made up of either metal or glass. And the question is, did you buy from the guy a kli that's a kli seuda? Because the Mechaber Paskins in Siman Kuf Chav, Hakone me'agoy kli seuda, afal pishem chadoshim tzichem tefillah. So what exactly is a kli seuda? Let me ask you a question. A bottle opener. Is there a fancier word for that? Corkscrew or something? You know what I'm talking about? So it's made of metal, and it's used to open bottles. Is that called a klei seuda? What about spices? Spices, I would say, is a klei seuda because you eat the spices. Like, for example, a salt shaker. I don't know, is that called a kli seuda? On the one hand, the salt will enhance the taste of the food that you're eating. On the other hand, it's not really part of the seuda. Nobody eats salt per se. You eat the meat with the salt, let's say, whatever, fresh, So what exactly is a kli seuda? Like, let's say, for example, I could show it to you here in my kitchen here. You have scissors that are used to cut a chicken. Like, let's say you buy a whole chicken, you want to cut it into 4 parts, whatever it might be. Is that a kli seuda? I mean, it's not like the knife that you use on the table to cut your food. Here, you use the scissor in the kitchen to cut the chicken into parts, but it's not a kli seuda. It's not part of the seuda. You might call it hechsher hasuda. It's a preparation for the seuda. Is that also called a kli seuda? So if you have a kli that never comes in contact with food, clearly doesn't need tefillah. Because the basic definition of a kli suda is that it's a kli that comes in contact with the food. What about a tripod? It's interesting, in the poskim it's called the dreyfus, which is a literal translation of tripod. It's got 3 legs, dreyfus. What do you use it for? You put a hot pot on top of the dreyfus so it shouldn't burn the tablecloth. But it's not really a kli suda. Now you understand, a spoon, a fork, a knife, a bowl, a plate, a pot, those are kli suda. But I'm not sure that a tripod is a kli suda.
Why would you think it would?
Because it's on the table. So anything that's used in the context of a suda and enhances your suda, if that kli finds its way onto the table, then it should need tefillah. What about a toaster? What would be your knee-jerk response?
Probably yes, but
for sure it should need tefillah. Why? It's no difference than a pot, right? You heat up the food in a pot, and you heat up your bread in a toaster. Hopefully, you won't burn it.
But we don't say that an oven needs.
An oven is called mechubel lakarka. So wait a second. A kli, by definition, is not mechubel lakarka. An oven is never makabel tuma because it's mechubel lakarka, and a kli is makabel tuma because it is not mechubel lakarka. In fact, in Dini Momenos, there's a different word for a kli, and that's called metaltal. And metaltal, by definition, means it's not tied down to the karka. It's metaltal. You move it back and forth. So this is one of the serious issues the poskim deal with. I mean, a toaster is a kli suda. It prepares the food. A toaster is made of metal. Am I right? I don't think there's such thing as a wooden toaster. A wooden toaster would last you for 1 piece of bread, and that's all. So Moshe Feinstein has a very interesting chiddush about a toaster. Do you remember this?
Plug it in.
What do you say, Joe? What, you remember this?
It's not complete until you plug it in. So it's not your
So I didn't know that was Rav Moshe. That's another answer to the toaster issue, because if you want to take a toaster to the mikveh and dunk it in, you might have problems afterwards. But what I remember from the Tzurba Rav Moshe, maybe it'll come up here, I don't think so, is that he claims that a clay suda has to fit into one of 2 descriptions. Either you use it to eat, as you eat from a bowl, you eat from a plate, you use a spoon, a knife, and a fork. Those are clay suda in the sense that you eat with these keilim. And a toaster doesn't fit into that category. Or you use the kli to prepare food so that the food now becomes part of the suda. But if you have a kli and all the food you put into that kli is edible by definition, that's not a kli suda. Why? Because you're not eating with it, and it's not preparing food that was unedible and making it into edible. So, for example, a toaster. So you put bread in the toaster. The bread is edible. It's not like a pot where you put raw whatever into the pot, and that raw whatever cannot be eaten. It only is eaten because of the kli, and that's where it's cooked. That's called a kli suda. Kli suda in the sense that it makes it possible for the food to be eaten in the suda. Because the food was inedible. Now, Joe mentions another possible solution to the problem of a toaster, and that is that the toaster doesn't work unless you plug it in. Once it has to be plugged in, it becomes mechuber lekarka. Why? Because in a state of polush, of movable, it's non-functional. So that would mean that any electric kli that can only function if you plug it into the electricity does not need tefillah. Very important breakthrough of Rav Moshe Feinstein. Mechuber lekarka. Electricity means mechuber lekarka. Now, in the case of a corkscrew, in my humble opinion, it does not need tefillah. It's not a kli suda because I don't eat with it. Not only that, generally speaking, we don't even put it on the table. You've got a bottle of wine, you use the corkscrew to open the wine, and that's something that goes on, in the kitchen or in the living room, but not on the table. It doesn't really find its way on the table. But on the other hand, the salt shaker, if it's made of glass or metal, then might be a kli suda. But then again, according to Rav Moshe, what does that salt do for you? You're not eating with the salt shaker. And not only that, the salt is only an addition to the food, but it doesn't make the food edible. Maybe one could argue that a salt shaker, according to Rav Moshe, should be similar to a toaster. Again, not because it's mechubar. I'm not going with that approach. A toaster, a salt shaker is not mechubar. Now, by the way, we didn't even talk yet about the Maisa Tevilah. In many Keilim, the Maisa Tevilah is complicated. Like, for example, if you have a salt shaker that has very small holes, very small openings, then unless you remove the top, the water is not going to get in. So that's going to be a problem. Now, in the case of a thermos, you have no problem dunking a thermos into the tevilah, into the mikveh, but the question is whether the thermos really requires tevilah. If the inside of the thermos would be made of a hard plastic, and if the metal is only on the outside of the thermos, then in all likelihood it does not need tevilah at all. I would never make a bracha on a thermos if I'm being tovel. And in many cases, I wouldn't even bother being tovel. Now, there's certain Keilim that because of their structure, they're very small, if you put them into the mikveh, the water doesn't really go down into the bottom of the kli. It just, the water of the mikveh is the volume of the water is too great to really fit into a small hole and have the mikveh go all the way back down to the bottom of the kli. So here's where we use a halacha called hashaka. Are you familiar with it? In mikvahos, this is a major concept. And hashaka means that if I take a kli and I put it into the mikvah, if the kli is open on top, then I don't have to guarantee that the kli was submerged into the mikvah. All I have to do is make sure that the kli is on the same level as the top of the mikvah water, the surface level of the mikvah water. So he quotes here at number 31 on page 191, Omar Rabba Baravua fi Keilim Chadoshim b'mashma da Yishanim ulevanim v'libnam is kichadoshim dam. So once you are machshir a kli that had a blia of isur, then you're going to have to be tovel them. Why? It's kichadoshim dam. It's like you bought a brand new kli. So we should always make this distinction between hechsher kelim and Tevilas kelim. The purpose of hechsher kelim is to remove the blias isur, but that's not enough because you need tvila, and tvila has nothing to do with the isur balua in the kli. The Torah says that you have to be tovel the kli. Now, what's the status of Zuzah de Sarbala? Zuzah de Sarbala is a scissors, the likes of which could be used for a Suda, but this scissors is for shearing the wool off the back of a sheep. And he answers, Amalek, Kli Suda Amur B'Parsha. A sarbala is not a kli suda. But as we said before, this doesn't apply to a scissors that's designated to cut meat. Rashi says, Zuzah de Sarbala, misparayim shegozavem big date semer. It's used by the tailors to cut cloth that's made of wool. Now, I'd like to raise another question. While it's true that Hechsher Keilim is not going to circumvent and replace the need for Tevilas Keilim, but what I was wondering is, in a kli that has a bli of Isur, can you be tovel it, or do you first have to remove the blias Isur through Hechsher Keilim, and only then subsequently can you be mitayr it in the mikveh?
Didn't you say that once you're kosher it, it's considered like a new kli? So how would you be able to do the tefillah beforehand? As soon as you kosher it, it's going to be a new kli.
No, we're saying that just like a new kli needs tefillah, so too a kli after hechsher kelim needs tefillah. We're not saying it's a brand new kli. The kli didn't change its status or its identity by virtue of the hechsher kelim when you remove the blia.
Okay.
Now, there is a case where you could change the identity of a kli, and that's when you put it into a burning hot furnace, and it changes the entire tzura. Okay, now we'll talk about Dreyfus. That's on page 192, paragraph number 33. Dreyfus, sheshoftim ola aleim es kederos enam tulim tefillah. Now, I'm going to assume that applies even if you put the Dreyfus on the table itself, but it's not a kli suda. Now he's got something called a Faidaliyash. Just not sure what that is. Anybody know what that word means? Is there someone who has access to Shulchan Aruch? Maybe could open it up. I can look in the Mishnah Berurah, maybe. No, the Mishnah Berurah is not going to help me because this is your idea. Okay. Now he has a discussion about a kli that doesn't come in contact with any food. I can't think of an example of what he has in mind here. What would be a kli that never comes into contact with food? Let's say you had a basket and you put bread in the basket and you put it on the table. The basket is made of gold, of glass. But you always put down some sort of a hefsek, some sort of a kerchief, whatever it might be, before you put the bread into the basket. So the bread never actually comes in direct contact with the basket. So he's saying if a kli never comes in contact with the food, then it does not need tefillah. So we have a case of a dreyfus, that doesn't need tefillah, because that's not a kli suda. Right? You don't eat with the dreyfus, nor do you prepare the food in the dreyfus. And then you have a kli that, although it has all the, external qualities of a kli suda, and you put it on the table, but there's always a hefsek between the food and the kli. And now we get to number 34. This is a very relevant question. What happens if, and I think this is the case of many bowls that you use for preparing a dough. So the food that's inside the kli is not roy lachila. It has the raw ingredients that will eventually make it into an edible food, but right now it's not edible at all. And it's only when you pour it into another kli, let's say a baking pan or so, then it becomes roy lachila. But right now it's dough. Let's say a cake dough. It's a pourable liquid dough. So you have a certain kli that you designate for that liquid dough. It doesn't need tefillah. So he says the following. If you have a kli that only prepares the food in the first stage, but it's not yet edible, and then you need it to put it into a second kli, which makes it edible, the second kli will require tefillah the bracha. The first kli, which is not a kli suda because the food in there is not edible, that kli will require tefillah but without a bracha. Now he has something called a chatzuva. Sheshoftim olea hakdera. I don't know, to me that seems very similar to the Dreyfus case. Filim lefamim nosin olea lechem lechamimam. So you have a heating unit on the bottom and a kli on top. And once in a while, you will actually heat up the food in the bottom part of the kli. Does that need tefillah? How would you call that in English? Let me just take a minute and look that up. I don't know, this doesn't really help me so much. I think he assumes that a chatzuva is very similar to a Dreyfus, except the difference is that a chatzuva has function over the fire. So although it's generally used to put a hot pot on top of the chatzuva, but sometimes you will heat up something on the chatzuva itself. Yeah, I'm wondering about the status of a plata. A blech, what we call, right? Does a blech need tefillah? Let's think about it. On the one hand, you don't. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Are you putting the food on it? You're not. You're putting the food. The food is in a pot or in a container,
Right.
which you're putting in the blech.
So that makes it like a Dreyfus in a sense that there's never food in the pot. But I don't know about you, but in our case, we actually put bread to warm it up on the plata itself.
Then I guess that takes it back to the other case, no?
On the
Right.
plata itself, or on like a little aluminum foil you put on the plata?
So if there's an aluminum foil, then it comes back to the concept that we had before, that the ochel is not nogea directly into the kli, because you always have a hefsek that separates it. But the only thing is that sometimes you might put the bread down directly on the plata, and there's no silver foil. So this comes onto what's called the ikar tashmisho. The fact that occasionally it is used as a kli suda, that doesn't mean it's chayav tefillah. That's got to be its main function. So that's what he, excuse me, writes here, number 35, on the second line, Holchim acha rov tashmisha. So rov tashmisha of a plata, for example, would be where the kedera is on top of the plata and the food is in the kedera. And therefore it's p'tura mina tefillah. But what about, he says, a maducha, which is used to take coffee beans and crush the coffee beans, so that then you could take the coffee and pour hot water over the coffee. Well, again, this is number 35 chaf. What would you, without looking, if you didn't look at, what would be your intuitive sense?
The coffee still has to be cooked, no?
Excellent. Since he uses the maducha only on coffee beans which are unedible, you can't take coffee and eat it. Again, if you're in the Holocaust, maybe you do, I don't know. But normally we don't eat coffee. We pour the water into the coffee to make the coffee edible. So that kli, which is called a madocha, that's used to crush the coffee beans, does not need tefillah. Now, it's very interesting because he quotes Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach here in a kind of a scenario that was very common back in the day. Today, maybe it's less common. Do you remember the milk bags, right? So you put the milk bag into let's say, a glass container or a metal container. Does that need tefillah or not? So Reb Shlomo Zalman says it doesn't need tefillah, because the food never comes in contact with the kli, right? Because the milk is in a plastic bag. Now, he has something here in the name of Shlomo Zalman at the end of 36. I see we're running out of time. But maybe you could help me figure this out. He says, Kli sheder tashmishu al yedei sakit, right? So you don't put the food directly in the kli. the food is in a bag, like the case of the milk that we spoke about before. He says, whatever you take out or you put in, it's from that bag, but not from the kli itself directly. Then the bag is a hefsek, and you don't need tefillah. Aval, here's where I need your help. Mapa. So what does that mean? Derech l'shtamish rak al yedei prisas mapa. Puts out a tablecloth. Well, what's he talking about here? I can't picture it in my mind. Well, let's talk about the table. Imagine taking a table for tevilah. Well, the food never comes in contact with the table because there's always a tablecloth in between. No, that doesn't make any sense. A tablecloth is not a kli suda.
Is it that the bag is like a mappa? In other words, you can really put the milk into this container.
Yeah, but in that case, Joe, he says you don't need tevilah.
No, but he's saying in this, if the tashmish of this bag is just the bag is like is just not to make the kli dirty. Really, you would put
right. So again, I agree with you 100%, Joe. But the case of the milk, that's something different, right? The milk is in a bag, and it's not directly in the kli. But you're talking about a case now where I put something to separate the food from the kli because otherwise the kli will get dirty.
Right. Like, so I'm saying, see, it's not that the kli, when you used to have the milk bags had a bag, a container that was exactly shaped the same as it, right? And it was meant that you kept the bag in the milk, right?
Right.
And you poured it. And that was the tashmish. But here he's talking maybe about you've got a real milk container. It's got on the picture on the side of it of a cow or milk or whatever, and really it's meant that you're supposed to pour the milk into it and keep it in the fridge like that. But you're keeping it in the bag because you just don't want to dirty it.
I see.
I'm asking you. That's the way I'm looking at it.
Yeah, I was thinking of a slightly different case. I was thinking, let's say, for example, you have a platter for cake. It's a cake platter. But you never put the cake directly on the platter. And the platter might be glass, it might be made of metal. You always put a cloth that separates the cake from the platter. And Rav Shlomo Zalman is saying in such a case, the platter itself needs tevilah. Why is that different than the milk container? He says, since he only uses the platter with the priestess mappa, so that's not because he wants to, he wants to make a hefsek.
Right. It's to
protect the kli, to maintain the kli,
or to make it look nicer.
Yeah. Well, I mean maintain. I mean to say it's clean, and you don't have to wash it and so forth.
Or to make that the cake looks nicer, maybe when you're presenting it.
Yeah. Oh, it looks nicer because it has that.
Yeah, like a tablecloth. So then there it's really for the enhancement of the food.
Oh, I thought you were saying it's to protect the kli from getting dirty.
No, it's to make, I'm changing, I'm going with what you're saying. He's using this protection, not necessarily to keep that dirt clean, but really to enhance how the food looks.
Oh, I see. If it's for aesthetic purposes, like it's a
Right.
nicer presentation,
A
then
mappa
you would
is
need tefillah.
right. He's saying it's a tablecloth. It's like a tablecloth. Make it look even more presentable. So therefore, it's really meant.
But you also agree that if it's only there to keep the cleanliness of the kli, it needs tefillah. The only case it doesn't need tefillah is where the food is always contained in a some sort of a receptacle, if you will.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's just make a note. So we got up to page 193, which is the last page. And let me just ask you, maybe next time we'll just finish it up for about 5 minutes or so, but what topic would you be interested in?
What's the Rav interested in?
Well, let me just read to you a number of possible topics and you'll tell me which, might be relevant or contemporary. And David will have this in the Tochen and Yonim. You'll have actually a page and a quarter, which has the whole list. So I'm just looking at that list. He has Nemonis Bekashrus, who's trustworthy in Kashrus. He's got Hilchas Dam, if you find blood. Hilchas Toloim, if you check for bugs and so forth.
But I'd like that one.
Toloim?
Yeah.
Okay. So Blinen,
if anybody, I'm just throwing it out, but whatever anybody else.
But Joe, do you have WhatsApp?
Yes, I do.
So do me a favor, if you probably have my number, just write me a one-line WhatsApp, just so that. All right, then. Okay,
remember, yes.
Great.
Hey, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Let me wish you all a great week and a great Shabbos that's coming up. I mean, I know it's only Wednesday morning in your clock, but.